All right, settle in, you connoisseurs of existential dread and historical discomfort. Dim the gaslight, if you can find one, and try to ignore the faint, persistent scent of horse manure and human desperation wafting in through your digital window. Welcome to the Victorian era, a time of unparalleled technological marvels, industrial smog so thick you could carve it, and a deeply ingrained, almost theatrical, repression of anything remotely enjoyable. It was an age of stiff collars, even stiffer morals, at least on the surface, and an almost pathological fascination with death, disease, and anything that promised a temporary escape from both. And into this magnificent, grimy, deeply hypocritical theater of human existence waltzed a liquid so captivating, so insidious, so utterly green, it would forever etch itself into the annals of artistic legend and public health hysteria. We are, of course, talking about absinthe, the green fairy, the green muse, the green peril. Pick your poison, literally. For a brief, intoxicating, utterly bonkers period, this potent potable wasn't just a drink, it was a phenomenon, a shimmering, emerald siren song whispered from the bottom of a glass, promising heightened perception, artistic brilliance, and perhaps, just perhaps, a front row seat to your own unraveling sanity. It was the energy drink of the bohemians, the muse of the melancholic, and the scapegoat for every regrettable decision made between dusk and dawn. You see, the Victorians, bless their cotton socks, had a rather robust approach to self-medication. When the pressures of polite society became too much, and the omnipresent dread of cholera wasn't quite doing it for you, there was always something readily available to take the edge off. Opium dens operated with a surprising degree of open secret discretion. Laudanum was practically a household condiment, and cocaine was marketed as a perfectly wholesome cure-all, sometimes even for children. Honestly, it makes today's wellness trends look positively demure. But even amongst this pantheon of chemical comfort, absinthe stood out. It didn't just numb you, it allegedly transformed you. It promised a doorway, not just to oblivion, but to an entirely different plane of reality, a vibrant, terrifying, demon-haunted landscape glimpsed through the bottom of a cloudy green glass. So here's the central, nagging, endlessly fascinating question that kept temperance societies in business and artists in an eternal state of agitated inspiration. Did this emerald elixir really make them see things? Did the green fairy whisper secrets, conjure creatures, or pull back the veil to reveal the true, hideous nature of the universe? Or, and prepare yourself for a devastatingly unromantic suggestion, was it just incredibly effective marketing for what amounted to a rather spectacular and incredibly well-documented public breakdown? We're about to embark on a journey, dear listener, a slow, deliberate, perhaps even somniferous descent into the depths of green liquor and dubious sanity. We'll wade through the murky waters of historical accounts, peer into the gaslit gloom of forgotten Parisian cafes, and perhaps even catch a whiff of the peculiar blend of anise, alcohol, and artistic aspiration that permeated the air. And who knows, by the end of it, you might just find yourself questioning the very nature of reality, or, at the very least, wondering if you, too, could use a tiny, green, mind-bending pick-me-up. But mostly, you'll probably just get really, really sleepy. You're welcome. Every legendary monster, every captivating muse, every cultural touchstone that eventually spirals into a moral panic has to start somewhere. And for Absinthe, that beginning was, I'm afraid to tell you, profoundly, almost insultingly unsexy. Forget shadowy alchemists brewing forbidden potions in subterranean lairs. Forget ancient druids extracting mystical essences under the pale moonlight. Our story, if you can call it that without yawning, begins in a quiet, unassuming little valley in 18th century Switzerland. A place so quaint, so aggressively idyllic. You'd think the only thing brewing there was artisanal cheese and a healthy dose of ennui. Our protagonist, if we're stretching the definition of that word, is a Dr. Pierre Ordinaire. And before you start picturing a mad scientist with crackling electrodes and a manic gleam in his eye, let me just temper your expectations. Ordinaire isn't just his name, it's a descriptor. He was, by all accounts, just a regular doctor, one who, like many of his era, dabbled in herbal remedies. You see, back in the late 1700s, before pharmaceutical companies had perfected the art of selling you brightly colored pills for every conceivable affliction, doctors often whipped up their own concoctions. It was less about groundbreaking scientific discovery and more about, this herb seems to make people poop less, and this other one makes them burp more. Let's mix them and call it a day. Dr. Ordinaire, somewhere around 1792, was apparently tinkering with a blend of locally sourced botanicals. The key players in this botanical drama were Artemisia absinthium, which you might know as wormwood, along with Inus and fennel. Now, wormwood, for those of you who haven't had the pleasure of licking an old gardening glove, is a rather bitter herb. Historically, it was used as a vermifuge, which is a polite way of saying it made you expel intestinal worms. Charming, I know. Anise, on the other hand, is that licoricey flavor you either love or despise, often found in black jelly beans, which are objectively the worst kind of jelly bean. And fennel, well, fennel is just a vegetable that thinks it's an herb. So Dr. Ordinaire, presumably not in search of a mind-bending elixir, but rather a robust digestive or a particularly aggressive laxative, steeped these herbs in alcohol, and thus absinthe, or at least its very, very distant ancestor, was born. Its initial claims? Oh, they were modest. A veritable cure-all. For tapeworms, naturally, given the wormwood. For indigestion. For bad breath, probably. And yes, for ennui, because apparently a stiff drink was the 18th century equivalent of an antidepressant and far more readily available than therapy. It was a potent, bitter, botanical brew designed more for medicinal efficacy than for inspiring surrealist masterpieces. It was essentially the Vicks VapoRub of its day, except you drank it. And it tasted like slightly medicinal black licorice and probably burned all the way down. But the good doctor wasn't exactly a marketing genius. His concoction remained a rather niche, local remedy. It wasn't until a shrewd businessman named Major Dubé, because every origin story needs a military man, even if he's just a businessman, acquired the recipe from Ordinaire's descendants that things started to get interesting. Dubied, with a far keener eye for profit than for parasitic infections, eventually sold the recipe to his son-in-law, a fellow named Henri Louis Pernod. And that, my friends, is where the story truly begins to pivot from pharmacy shelves to the far more exciting and, admittedly, equally medicinal world of the Parisian bistro. Pernod, a name you might recognize, saw the potential. Not just in its ability to evict unwelcome gut residents, but in its ability to kickstart a revolution in social drinking. He industrialized production, refined the recipe ever so slightly, though still keeping that delightful wormwood at its heart, and began bottling it for the masses. So, from a quiet Swiss valley, from the humble intentions of a doctor named Ordinaire, this potent green liquid began its slow, deliberate migration. It left behind the sterile confines of the medicine cabinet, the dreary promise of health, and embraced the intoxicating allure of hedonism, and all without ever truly shedding its initial, utterly mundane claims to medicinal efficacy. Because, let's be honest, nothing makes you feel better about downing a glass of rocket fuel quite like telling yourself it's good for your spleen. So we've established that absinthe started its life as a rather unglamorous, worm-expelling tonic. But how does a humble medicinal brew transform into the intoxicating, mind-bending, demon-conjuring elixir of an entire generation? Well, as with many things in history, you can thank an army. Specifically, the French army, and their rather unpleasant encounter with the North African climate during the conquest of Algeria in the mid-19th century. Imagine, if you will, being a French soldier, shipped off to a dusty, unfamiliar land. The sun beats down with a ferocity you've never experienced. The water, well, let's just say potable was a term used very loosely, if at all. Dysentery was rampant, malaria was a constant buzzing threat, and morale, much like the local cuisine, was probably a bit thin. In this delightful environment, the military doctors, ever resourceful, began prescribing absinthe as a prophylactic, a preventative measure against malaria, and a digestive aid against the notoriously uncooperative microbes lurking in the water. Why absinthe? Because, remember, it was originally conceived as a cure-all, and a healthy dose of alcohol did kill germs, even if it simultaneously pickled the internal organs of the person consuming it. So, soldiers were given daily rations of absinthe, often diluted, to ward off disease, and, naturally, to cope with the sheer, unadulterated misery of being a soldier in a colonial war. It was cheap, it was strong, and it offered a brief, fiery respite from the oppressive heat and the even more oppressive boredom. You can practically picture it: sun-baked tents, the distant murmur of battle, and a group of weary men nursing their cloudy green rations, perhaps for the first time feeling a little less there. When these soldiers returned home from Algeria, they brought with them not just tales of daring exploits and exotic lands, but also a deeply ingrained taste for the green fairy. They had become accustomed to its bitter, anise-laced kick, its potent, numbing embrace. And unlike the generals who had prescribed it, they weren't thinking of its medicinal value anymore. They were thinking about the buzz. This, my friends, was the mid-19th century boom. The green fairy's grand, spectacular, and utterly inebriated entrance onto the world stage. Suddenly, this once niche tonic became the drink. It wasn't just popular, it was ubiquitous. You couldn't walk into a Parisian cafe, a bustling bistro, or even a relatively respectable establishment without seeing the telltale ritual unfolding. Absinthe replaced the traditional aperitifs, those gentle pre-dinner drinks meant to whet the appetite. Why sip a delicate vermouth when you could dive headfirst into a glass of brain-fizzing emerald firewater? This shift in social habits gave birth to l'heure verte, or the green hour. It wasn't just a time, It was an institution. From around 5 p.m. to 7 p.m., as the gaslights flickered to life and the city transitioned from the drudgery of the workday to the hazy promise of the evening, Parisians of all stripes descended upon their preferred establishments for their daily dose of green. Imagine the scene: a bustling Parisian cafe, the air thick with cigarette smoke, the clatter of ceramic cups, and the low hum of conversation. The mirrors on the walls reflect the flickering gaslight, creating a shimmering, almost spectral glow. And everywhere you look, there are glasses containing that peculiar, milky green liquid, slowly being prepared with elaborate precision. The clinking of the slotted spoons, the drip, drip, drip of water over a sugar cube, the mesmerizing clouding of the liquid as it looshes. It wasn't just drinking, it was a performance. A daily ritual, a sacrament of sorts, ushering you into a different state of mind. And why this sudden, overwhelming devotion? Well, it was cheap. Devastatingly cheap, especially compared to wine or other spirits. This made it accessible to everyone, from the struggling artist to the disgruntled factory worker. It was strong, notoriously so, often clocking in at 45 to 75% alcohol by volume. This meant a little went a long way, or perhaps a lot went a very long way into a very deep hole. And crucially, it was stylishly dangerous. It carried an air of forbidden fruit, an intoxicating whiff of the bohemian, the artistic, the slightly scandalous. It wasn't just a drink, it was a statement. A green-tinted wink to the world that you were in on the secret, that you dared to flirt with the edges of societal norms, even if you were just trying to forget your landlord. The green fairy wasn't just present, she was omnipresent. Her emerald gaze was reflected in every cafe mirror, her bitter kiss on every lip. She had truly arrived, not as a humble healer, but as a grand, enigmatic enchantress, ready to lead an entire generation down a very pleasant, very green, and ultimately very perilous path. And you, dear listener, are right there with them, inhaling the smoke, smelling the cheap perfume, and watching the ritual unfold, wondering if you too should risk a sip of that alluring, ominous green. Now that absinthe has firmly established itself as the liquid pulse of Parisian society, replacing your grandma's sherry with something that could strip paint, it was only natural that it would find its most fervent devotees among the city's burgeoning artistic class. Because who needs stable mental health when you have a potent, green, potentially mind-altering beverage to fuel your genius? The late 19th century in Paris was a crucible of creativity. It was a time when the stifling traditions of academic art were being shattered, replaced by the vibrant, often chaotic, explosions of Impressionism, Post-Impressionism, and eventually Cubism. Artists, writers, poets, and musicians flocked to Paris, drawn by its magnetic pull, its promise of liberation, and its comparatively relaxed attitude toward public intoxication. This was the era of the bohemian, a term that essentially meant artist who lives in a charming attic, owns very few possessions, and probably has a persistent cough, but looks incredibly interesting doing it. And what was the quintessential accoutrement of the bohemian? Not a fancy palette, not a pristine manuscript, but a glass of absinthe. It became the symbiotic partner to creativity, the enigmatic emerald muse that whispered inspiration into the ears of the tormented genius. You could practically chart the rise of modern art alongside the consumption statistics of the Green Fairy. From the smoke-filled, delightfully unhygienic cafes of Montmartre, perched high above the city like a haven for artistic vagabonds, to the more intellectual, equally smoke-filled left bank's artistic squats and salons, absinthe was everywhere. It was in the hands of the poets scribbling verses on stained napkins, the painters sketching furiously in their notebooks, and the playwrights debating the existential angst of a teapot. It wasn't just a drink. It was a potent symbol, a symbol of rebellion against bourgeois conformity, a declaration of artistic independence, and a rather sophisticated nod to one's own impending depravity. Imagine the scene. You're sitting in a cafe, the air thick with tobacco smoke and the faint aroma of stale wine. The conversation swirls around you, a heady mix of philosophy, politics, and who owes whom money. Across the table, a disheveled poet with eyes that have seen too much, and possibly too much absinthe, is passionately declaiming verses about the ephemeral nature of beauty. Next to him, a painter, his hands stained with pigment, stares intently into the depths of his cloudy green glass, convinced that the swirling patterns within hold the key to his next masterpiece. Was it a shortcut to genius? Well, that's the $1,000,000, or rather the 1 franc a glass question, isn't it? The artists certainly thought so. Or, at least, they liked to tell themselves that. Absinthe, with its high alcohol content and its rumored mind-altering properties, which we'll dissect later, don't worry, seemed to unlock something. It dulled the mundane, sharpened the edges of perception, and perhaps, more importantly, it lowered inhibitions to a delightful, dangerous degree. It allowed the artists to see the world differently, or at least to think they were seeing it differently, which, for creative purposes, often amounts to the same thing. It became intertwined with the very persona of the artist, the misunderstood, the tortured, the one who dared to peer into the abyss and paint what they saw. It wasn't just about getting drunk. It was about achieving a certain state of heightened awareness, a blurring of the lines between reality and imagination. Or, perhaps, it was just a rather convenient, green-tinted excuse for chronic procrastination, an impressive lack of personal hygiene, and a lifetime of questionable life choices that could later be repackaged as artistic temperament. The truth, as always, is probably somewhere in the middle. Absinthe undoubtedly played a role in the lives of many Victorian artists. It fueled their late-night discussions, it loosened their tongues, and it probably gave them some truly spectacular hangovers that they could then mine for artistic angst. It provided a potent escape from the often harsh realities of an artist's life, the poverty, the rejection, the constant struggle for recognition. So, as you watch that milky green liquid swirl in the glass and observe the intense, almost manic expressions on the faces of the artists around you, you have to wonder, is this the sacred ritual of unlocking creative potential? Or is it simply a collective exercise in self-delusion? An expensive, intoxicating performance designed to convince themselves, and everyone else, that they were touching something profound, when in reality, they were just getting exceptionally plastered on something that tasted vaguely of upset black licorice. The altar of art and absinthe, indeed. A potent, intoxicating, and deliciously dangerous combination. perfectly suited for a time when excess was art, and art was an excuse for excess. All right, let's get down to the brass tacks, or rather, the botanical components of our emerald enigma. Because when you're talking about a drink that purportedly makes people carve off their ears and see tiny green men, you naturally want to know what exactly was in that stuff anyway. And the answer, as with most things related to absinthe, is simultaneously fascinating, a touch underwhelming, and wildly exaggerated. The star of our show, the ingredient that bore the brunt of all the subsequent hysteria, is Artemisia absinthium. You know it as wormwood. It's a rather innocent-looking, silvery green herb, not unlike what you might see growing alongside a dusty road, minding its own business. But deep within its unassuming foliage lies a compound that would become the stuff of legend, the supposed culprit behind all the madness, thujone. Now, for decades, centuries even, thujone was whispered about in hushed, reverent tones, often with a slight shudder. It was supposedly a powerful hallucinogen, a psychotropic agent, the key to unlocking those vivid, terrifying, demon-haunted visions. The Victorian public, fueled by sensationalist press and an inherent fear of anything that wasn't strictly gin or sherry, imagined thujone as a kind of liquid LSD, a direct conduit to the darkest corners of the mind. They pictured artists frothing at the mouth, eyes wide with terror or ecstasy, all thanks to this mystical, brain-melting molecule. And here's where we get to separate the delicious, dramatic myth from the decidedly less dramatic, but still interesting, modern scientific understanding. Because, spoiler alert, thujone, at the concentrations found in traditionally distilled absinthe, is not a powerful hallucinogen. You heard me. All those terrifying visions, all those green demons doing the can-can on your mantelpiece, probably not just the thujone. Thujone is a neurotoxic compound. In extremely high doses, far beyond what you typically consume, even in a rather aggressive absinthe binge, it can indeed cause convulsions. It affects GABA receptors in the brain, much like certain other compounds, and in truly massive quantities, it can lead to seizures. But the amount required to induce genuine hallucinations or severe psychotropic effects is so astronomically high that you would likely die of acute alcohol poisoning long before the thujone itself started making you see mythical creatures doing ballet. Your liver would stage a hostile takeover, and your brain would simply shut down in protest, long before you started having meaningful conversations with a sentient teapot. So the notion of thujone as some sort of magic, mind-bending key was largely a delightful bit of marketing and a convenient scapegoat. It was a chemical hook for a public eager to believe in the exotic, dangerous allure of the drink. It gave the Green Fairy a scientific-sounding reason for its perceived malevolence, even if that science was based more on conjecture and moral panic than on actual laboratory data. To put it in perspective, other contemporary substances offered far more reliable routes to altered states. Laudanum, a delightful concoction of opium dissolved in alcohol, was readily available and guaranteed a powerful, albeit often drowsy, trip. Ether, sometimes inhaled recreationally, offered a dizzying, disorienting high. Cocaine, as mentioned, was sold as a tonic. Hell, even certain fungi growing in damp fields could provide a more consistent hallucinatory experience than what you'd get from a glass of absinthe, unless you managed to drink a literal bathtub full of the stuff. The sensationalism surrounding thujone was a masterclass in fear-mongering. It turned a relatively common botanical compound into a boogeyman, a chemical villain responsible for societal decay and artistic madness. It provided a simple, tangible explanation for complex problems. Why worry about rampant alcoholism, syphilis, poor nutrition, or lead poisoning from faulty distillation equipment when you could just point to one mysterious little molecule and declare it the root of all evil? So, while the Victorians whispered about the hallucinogenic power of thujone, convinced it was the very essence of the green fairy's ability to conjure demons, the truth was, as often happens, a bit more mundane, a bit less dramatic, and far more attributable to good old-fashioned, high-proof ethanol and all the other delightful contaminants that came along for the ride. You're welcome for that dose of reality, though I suspect the idea of a potent brain melter is far more entertaining for a sleep-inducing history lesson. Perhaps you're already starting to hallucinate from boredom? Good. My work here is done. If you've spent any time at all around the kind of people who enjoy a good, robust evening of enthusiastic imbibing, you'll know that excessive alcohol consumption isn't exactly a recipe for peak physical or mental performance. But when it came to absinthe, the Victorians went a step further. They didn't just label it as bad for you, they invented an entire, rather dramatic, syndrome, absinthism. This wasn't merely a hangover. This was a descent into a specific, green-tinged, demon-conjuring madness that was supposedly unique to the green fairy. The symptoms attributed to absinthism read like a particularly grim checklist for a Victorian asylum intake. We're talking convulsions, tremors so severe you couldn't hold a spoon, which, ironically, was key to the absinthe ritual, and a generalized creeping paralysis that would make even the most dedicated couch potato feel productive. And then, of course, the main event, the hallucinations. Not just vague shadows, mind you, but vivid, terrifying visions, often of grotesque figures, tiny green imps, and other delightfully unsettling apparitions. Think of it as a personalized horror show, directed by your own failing brain cells and sponsored by Pernod. Victorian medical texts, often more descriptive than diagnostic, spoke of a unique green madness, characterized by excitability, nightmares, and a gradual, creeping transformation of the individual into a pale, gaunt, trembling wreck. They believed absinthe was particularly insidious, attacking the nervous system in a way no other spirit could. It wasn't just alcoholism, it was absinthism, a more exotic, more terrifying, and far more morally reprehensible form of self-destruction. But here's the rub, and it's a rather large, inconvenient rub that often gets glossed over when the pitchforks come out. Were these truly unique symptoms specifically caused by absinthe and its notorious thujone, or were they simply the well-documented, utterly predictable effects of severe, chronic alcoholism, exacerbated by a delightful cocktail of other, equally charming factors endemic to the era? Let's unpack that, shall we? First, there's the sheer quantity of alcohol. Absinthe, remember, was potent, and people drank a lot of it. Chronic, heavy alcohol consumption, regardless of whether it's green or brown or clear, leads to a host of neurological and physical problems. Delirium tremens, a severe form of alcohol withdrawal, can cause tremors, confusion, rapid heart rate, and, yes, incredibly vivid and terrifying hallucinations. So, a fair chunk of these absinthic symptoms, were likely just bog-standard, garden-variety alcoholism, doing what it does best, systematically dismantling the human body and mind. Then we add the delightful layers of Victorian public health. Poor diet was rampant, even among those who weren't impoverished artists. Malnutrition can profoundly affect brain function. Lead poisoning was also a very real, very prevalent threat. Cheap absinthe, looking to cut corners, and often looking to achieve that vibrant green hue on a budget, was sometimes distilled in cheap copper stills that leached lead into the liquor. Lead poisoning, if you're unfamiliar, is not a good time. It can cause neurological damage, cognitive impairment, tremors, and a whole host of other delightful symptoms that could easily be mistaken for a green madness. You're practically drinking toxic paint thinner with your evening tipple. And let's not forget undiagnosed syphilis. Yes, that silent, creeping horror of the Victorian era. Neurosyphilis, the late-stage manifestation of the disease, can lead to severe neurological and psychiatric symptoms, including delusions, paranoia, and, yes, hallucinations. So, imagine a struggling artist, suffering from chronic alcoholism, malnutrition, a touch of lead poisoning, and an untreated venereal disease, all exacerbated by the social pressures and anxieties of a rapidly changing world. Does it sound like you need a magical hallucinogenic wormwood compound to explain why they might be seeing things? Or does it sound like a perfectly reasonable recipe for a complete mental and physical breakdown, elegantly dressed up as a specific affliction? The transformation of the green fairy from a delightful buzz to a debilitating, demon-conjuring disease in the public imagination was a gradual, creeping process. It was fueled by anecdote, moral panic, and a convenient desire to blame a single identifiable evil for a complex web of societal problems. It allowed people to ignore the systemic issues of poverty, public health, and access to actual medical care, and instead point a trembling finger at the green liquor, declaring, "Aha, that is the problem." So next time you picture a Victorian artist grappling with absinthism, remember it wasn't just the wormwood. It was a potent, terrifying cocktail of desperation, neglect, chemical contaminants, and good old-fashioned ethanol, all stirred together in a society eager to find a villain. And the green fairy, with her alluring, mysterious nature, made for a perfectly picturesque, perfectly terrifying, and perfectly convenient one. You almost feel sorry for her, having to carry the weight of all that human misery. Almost. When you conjure an image of the tormented artist, racked by genius and addiction, the figure of Vincent van Gogh often leaps to mind. And inevitably, the story of his ear and his alleged devotion to absinthe comes with it, like a particularly persistent shadow. Because if there's one thing the public loves more than a genius, it's a genius who self-destructs, especially if you can blame it on a conveniently scandalous green drink. Van Gogh, the undisputed king of expressive brushstrokes and existential angst, is perhaps the most infamous alleged casualty of the green fairy. His life, as you probably know, was a tumultuous, heartbreaking saga of artistic struggle, profound poverty, and a relentless, all-consuming battle with severe mental illness. He poured his soul onto canvas, creating masterpieces of vibrant color and swirling emotion, all while his inner world was a maelstrom of despair and paranoia. And, according to popular lore, absinthe was his constant companion, his emerald muse, and ultimately the direct cause of his most infamous act of self-mutilation. Did absinthe truly make him cut off his ear? It's a story so compelling, so dramatically potent, that it's almost irresistible. Imagine it. A night of frantic drinking, the bitter green liquid fueling a psychotic break, culminating in a gruesome act of self-harm. It fits the narrative perfectly, doesn't it? The mad artist driven to the brink by the nefarious green fairy. But, as with most sensational historical narratives, the truth is a little murkier, a little more complex, and frankly, a lot less cinematic. While Van Gogh certainly drank absinthe, as did most artists in Arles at the time, to lay the blame for his ear entirely at the feet of the green fairy is a gross oversimplification. It's like blaming the existence of all modern reality TV on a single bad audition. The man was a walking, talking, painting cocktail of severe mental illness, likely bipolar disorder and/or schizophrenia, compounded by crushing poverty, social isolation, and an almost pathological inability to manage his own emotional landscape. Add to that a diet that was likely atrocious. He often subsisted on coffee, bread, and alcohol, and possible lead poisoning from the pigments he so vigorously applied to his canvases, and you have a recipe for neurological disaster. Some historians even suggest he may have been suffering from belladonna poisoning, as he was reportedly known to chew on certain plants in attempts to self-medicate, which could certainly induce hallucinations and delirium. Imagine that, thinking you're finding solace in nature, only to discover you've just ingested something that will make your personal demons do a particularly aggressive tango in your frontal lobe. So, when that fateful night arrived, December 23rd, 1888, after a particularly explosive argument with his friend Paul Gauguin, the subsequent act of self-mutilation was not a spontaneous absinthe-induced aberration. It was the tragic crescendo of a lifetime of psychological torment, a breaking point reached after years of internal struggle. Absinthe was just one more ingredient in a volatile cocktail that had been brewing for decades. Blaming it all on the wormwood is akin to blaming a single raindrop for a flood. It was part of the problem, yes, but hardly the sole instigator. Popular myths, however, thrive on simplicity. It's far easier to point to a mysterious green hallucinogenic drink than to grapple with the nuanced, uncomfortable realities of mental illness in an era that barely understood it, let alone treated it effectively. The absinthe made him do it narrative provided a neat, tidy, and utterly captivating explanation for something fundamentally inexplicable. It solidified the image of absinthe as the destroyer of genius, the dark side of artistic inspiration. And so, Van Gogh became absinthe's most famous, albeit unfairly maligned, poster boy. His sunflowers may glow with a vibrant yellow, but his story is forever tinged with that ominous shade of green. It's a sarcastic nod to our collective human tendency to find an easy target, a single villain, to explain away the messy, heartbreaking complexities of psychological suffering. The green fairy, it seems, was always ready to take the fall. Because, let's face it, blaming a mythical spirit is always more satisfying than admitting society just didn't know what the hell it was doing. Beyond Van Gogh's ear, the green fairy cast her shimmering, intoxicating shadow over a multitude of other artistic luminaries, weaving herself into the very fabric of their creative output and public personas. From the grim, beautiful verses of symbolist poets to the stark, angular canvases of cubist pioneers, absinthe became an inseparable, almost essential component of the tortured, misunderstood genius. Let's turn our gaze to Charles Baudelaire, the quintessential poet of modern decay and urban angst. This man practically invented the concept of the flaneur, the detached observer of city life, strolling through the Parisian boulevards, soaking in its beauty and its squalor. His seminal work, Les Fleurs du Mal, The Flowers of Evil, scandalized polite society with its exploration of themes like decadence, eroticism, and the darker side of human existence. And what better companion for such an exploration than absinthe? Baudelaire was no stranger to artificial paradises, as he famously dubbed the altered states induced by various substances. He experimented with opium and hashish, seeking to unlock new layers of perception, to push the boundaries of human experience. But it was the green fairy that offered a unique kind of introspection, a bitter, stimulating clarity that allowed him to gaze into the abyss of his own soul and the soul of the city, and translate its exquisite ugliness into hauntingly beautiful verse. You can almost hear the clinking of the absinthe spoon as he penned lines describing the city as a ghastly paradise, his words imbued with that particular blend of intellectual cynicism and profound melancholy that only a truly dedicated absintteur could achieve. For Baudelaire, absinthe wasn't just a drink, it was a tool, a lens through which to examine the morbid beauty of a world in decline, a mirror reflecting his own poetic despair. Then we fast forward a bit and find the green fairy making her spectral appearance in the burgeoning art scene of early 20th century Paris, captivating the young, audacious Pablo Picasso. While Picasso's relationship with absinthe might not have been as notoriously self-destructive as some, his art certainly captured its pervasive presence and its melancholic allure. His absinthe drinker paintings, particularly from his Blue period, are haunting visual testaments to the era's obsession. Imagine standing before one of these canvases, a lone figure, often a woman, slumped over a cafe table, her face etched with a weary resignation, her gaze lost in the hazy depths of a cloudy green glass. The colors are somber, the lines stark, the atmosphere heavy with an unspoken sadness. Picasso wasn't just painting a person, he was painting a mood, a societal condition, the quiet desperation that absinthe both promised to alleviate and ultimately seemed to embody. These aren't celebratory images, they are observations, reflections of the quiet, almost spiritual ruin that many believed absinthe wrought. They freeze a moment in the green hour, capturing its profound melancholy, its seductive power, and its unspoken cost. You can practically smell the stale air, hear the distant murmur of conversation, and feel the cold weight of the glass in the hand of the subject, whose eyes betray an unsettling emptiness. And let us not forget Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec, the diminutive giant of Montmartre, whose life was as intimately intertwined with the gaslit cafes and brothels of Paris as the swirling patterns of a well-lushed absinthe. Suffering from congenital physical ailments, Lautrec found his solace and his artistic inspiration in the vibrant, often sordid, nightlife of the city. He chronicled the dancers, the prostitutes, the bohemians, and the drinkers with an unflinching gaze and a vibrant palate. His existence in the cafes was not just an observation, it was an immersion. And his absinthe habit, alongside his other libations, was as much a part of his daily routine as his easel. His work, much like his life, was a testament to the intoxicating, often dangerous, allure of the Parisian demi-monde, where absinthe flowed freely, blurring the lines between reality and the intoxicating performance of living. These artists, and countless others, found in absinthe not just a drink, but a narrative. It became inseparable from the persona of the tormented, misunderstood genius. It offered a convenient external explanation for internal struggles, a romanticized veneer over often painful realities. It allowed society to point to the green fairy as the source of their madness, rather than confronting the complex interplay of their genius, their mental health, their social circumstances, and the simple, devastating power of alcohol. So, whether through the lyrical despair of Baudelaire, the stark visual poetry of Picasso, or the unflinching gaze of Toulouse-Lautrec, absinthe transcended mere liquor. It became a character in its own right, a co-conspirator in the grand, dramatic narrative of artistic creation and self-destruction. And you, dear listener, are invited to witness this fascinating, darkly humorous tango between genius and self-delusion, all through the cloudy, green-tinted lens of history. Just try not to get any ideas. Absinthe wasn't just a drink. It was a performance, a meticulous, almost ceremonial ritual that transformed a simple act of imbibing into an elaborate spectacle of refined debauchery. It wasn't enough to simply pour it and drink it like some common peasant with their cheap wine. Oh no, the green fairy demanded reverence, a slow, deliberate unveiling of her potent charms, designed to lull one into oblivion with style. Imagine yourself in a Parisian cafe, circa 1890. The air is thick with the scent of tobacco, coffee, and something vaguely anise-like. You've ordered your absinthe, and the waiter, with a practiced flourish, places before you a tall glass, often with a measurement mark, a rather optimistic gesture, one might argue. Beside it, a bottle of absinthe, glistening a shocking emerald green. But that's not all. You'll also find a specific, often ornate, slotted spoon and a single sugar cube, poised delicately on its surface. This is where the magic, or rather the careful art of self-destruction, begins. The ritual starts with pouring the absinthe, a measure, more or less, into the glass. The liquid itself is a vibrant, almost unnatural green, promising exotic escapism, and perhaps just a hint of impending madness. Then, the slotted spoon is carefully placed across the rim of the glass. On this spoon rests the sugar cube, a small, white beacon of sweetness designed to temper the intense bitterness of the absinthe. This is not just any sugar cube, it's a prop, an integral part of the show. And now for the pièce de résistance, the slow drip of water. A carafe of ice-cold water, often with an elegant spout, is brought to the table. You, or the waiter, begin to slowly, deliberately pour or drip the water over the sugar cube. Drip, drip, drip. It's mesmerizing. Each drop dissolves a tiny bit of the sugar, carrying its sweetness down into the potent green liquor below, slowly, inexorably mixing. This isn't a race, it's a meditation, a slow surrender. As the sugared water mixes with the absinthe, something truly enchanting happens. The vibrant green liquid begins to cloud. It swirls and churns, transforming from a clear, jewel-toned emerald into an opaque, milky, opalescent shade of pale green or yellow-green. This phenomenon is known as the louche, pronounced louche. It's caused by the essential oils from the herbs, the anise, fennel, and wormwood, which are soluble in high-proof alcohol, but not in water. As the water dilutes the alcohol, these oils precipitate out, creating a beautiful swirling haze. It looks like liquid magic, like a dream forming in your glass, or perhaps a particularly aggressive swamp mist. And it was absolutely integral to the mystique. This ritual was more than just a way to prepare a drink. It was a performance of refined debauchery. It spoke of leisure, of sophistication, of an appreciation for the finer, more destructive things in life. It turned drinking into an art form, a slow, deliberate act that built anticipation and allowed one to savor the moment of transformation, both of the drink and, arguably, of one's own faculties. It wasn't about gulping, it was about the journey, a slow, gentle slide into oblivion, one meticulous drip at a time. And where did this ritual unfold? In the bustling Parisian cafes, naturally. Imagine the cacophony of sounds, the clinking of spoons against glass, the murmur of conversations, the soft hiss of gaslight, the occasional laughter that teetered on the edge of hysteria. The cafes were grand, often opulent spaces, adorned with mirrors and velvet, reflecting the endless procession of drinkers, each engaged in their private, public ritual. But it also happened in more clandestine gatherings, in the smoky back rooms of artists' studios, where the louche of absinthe was perhaps the only clear thing in a room full of half-formed ideas and desperate dreams. The sensory experience was unique. That bitter, intensely anise-flavored kick, a taste that some find alluring and others simply abhor, was central. It wasn't a sweet, easy drink. It demanded attention. It was complex, herbal, and unapologetically potent. The combination of the high alcohol content, the specific blend of botanicals, and the slow, deliberate preparation was designed to slowly, deliberately lull one into a particular state. It was a sensory assault and a gentle persuasion all at once. A sip of the cloudy green, a taste of its peculiar bittersweetness, and then a slow, insidious wave of warmth, followed by a peculiar clarity, or perhaps a profound blurring of the edges of reality. This ritual, this methodical preparation, cemented absinthe's status. It made it more than just a liquid. It made it an experience. It set it apart from mere spirits, elevating it to something almost sacred, almost spiritual. A green sacrament, performed daily by thousands, all seeking that delicate balance between heightened perception and utter annihilation. And as you sit there, watching the sugar dissolve, the water drip, and the liquid cloud, you can almost feel the threads of your own carefully constructed reality beginning to unravel, one slow, deliberate drop at a time. You realize, with a wry smirk, that this isn't just drinking, this is an induction. As delightful as the ritual of ruin might have been for the artistic set and the weary working class alike, the Green Fairy's reign was not destined to last. Because whenever something becomes too popular, too hedonistic, and too visibly enjoyed by people who aren't you, a moral panic is sure to follow, like a particularly unpleasant shadow. And for absinthe, that shadow arrived in the form of the temperance tornado. Across Europe and America, powerful temperance movements were gathering steam, fueled by religious zeal, social conservatism, and a genuine, albeit often misguided, concern for public health. These movements saw alcohol not just as a vice, but as the root of all evil: crime, poverty, moral decay, domestic violence, and probably also why your socks never quite matched. They preached abstinence, condemned intoxication, and sought to rid society of the scourge of drink. And in their righteous crusade, they needed a villain, a visible, tangible embodiment of all that was wrong with the world. Enter absinthe. With its hallucinatory reputation, its association with decadent artists, scandalous bohemians, and the working class seeking cheap escape, it was a convenient, almost perfect scapegoat. It wasn't just an alcoholic drink, it was the alcoholic drink. It was not merely intoxicating, it was insidious. It didn't just make you drunk, it made you mad. It was the embodiment of moral corruption, a liquid villain in a vibrant, alarming shade of green. The propaganda posters of the era are a testament to this hysteria. They depict the green fairy not as a beautiful muse, but as a skeletal ghoul, a demonic temptress, luring unsuspecting men to their ruin. You'd see images of a man, eyes wild and glazed, abandoning his family, losing his job, and eventually ending up a skeletal wreck, all under the malevolent influence of a glowing green bottle. Children, looking utterly terrified, would cling to their mothers as a shadowy, green-tinged monster loomed over their father, whose face was already contorted into a mask of absinthe-induced madness. It was less about nuanced public health warnings and more about absinthe will literally steal your soul and make you ugly. Newspapers, eager to sell copy, published sensationalized articles detailing the supposed horrors of absinthe addiction. They recounted lurid tales of individuals driven to madness, violence, and utter destitution by the green fairy. Every incident of public disorder, every act of domestic abuse, every unfortunate fall from grace by an artist or a laborer was quickly, conveniently, and often inaccurately attributed to absinthe. It wasn't that the person had a pre-existing mental condition, or was suffering from poverty, or was simply a violent drunk. No, it was the wormwood. It was the thujone. It was the green. The language used was deliberately hyperbolic. Absinthe was described as a poison, a destroyer of families, the liquid madness. It became a symbol for everything the temperance movements feared and loathed. It was a potent embodiment of all the anxieties of a rapidly industrializing, urbanizing society, grappling with social change and perceived moral decline. If you could just get rid of absinthe, the argument went, then all these other problems would magically disappear. The growing public outcry was immense and relentless. Petitions were signed, sermons were preached, and impassioned speeches were delivered in parliaments across Europe. Scientists, some genuinely concerned, others simply riding the wave of popular sentiment, published studies, often of dubious methodology, linking absinthe specifically to various forms of mental and physical degeneration. The collective voice of disapproval swelled into an unstoppable chorus, demanding action. The backlash was inevitable. The green fairy had flown too close to the sun, or rather, too close to the moral outrage of the masses. Her ubiquity, her allure, her very distinct green hue, which once made her so captivating, now made her an unmistakable target. She was too prominent, too iconic, too damn green to hide. She had become the poster child for everything wrong with society, and society, in its righteous indignation, was ready to strike her down. The stage was set for her dramatic downfall, and it wouldn't take much more than a particularly unfortunate family tragedy to light the fuse. You can practically hear the baying of the crowd, can't you? Ready to banish the demon in the bottle, convinced they were saving humanity, one highly alcoholic, bright green spirit at a time. Every moral panic needs a truly horrific, widely publicized event to cement its narrative, to provide that undeniable, sensational proof that the villain it has painstakingly created is, in fact, a real, tangible threat. For Absinthe, that pivotal, utterly tragic moment arrived in 1905 in a quiet little Swiss village called Comugny, in the form of the Jean Lanfray family massacre. And it wasn't just a nail in the coffin for the Green Fairy, it was a goddamn wrecking ball. Imagine, if you will, a serene summer day in rural Switzerland. Birds chirping, cows grazing, all the idyllic trimmings. And then, the horrifying scream. Jean Lanfray, a 31-year-old farm laborer, returned home one hot August afternoon in a state of advanced inebriation. He'd already had a truly impressive roster of alcoholic beverages that day. 2 glasses of absinthe, followed by crème de menthe, brandy, and a liter of wine for good measure, all before lunch. Because why settle for one form of self-destruction when you can sample the entire buffet? After a heated argument with his pregnant wife, Rose, he took a rifle and, in a terrifying fit of rage, shot and killed her, their 2 young daughters, Blanche and Rose, and then shot himself, though he survived his self-inflicted wound. The details of the crime were brutal, shocking, and utterly heartbreaking. But in the immediate aftermath, as the news spread like wildfire, the public narrative coalesced with alarming speed and terrifying simplicity. Absinthe made him do it. It wasn't about a man with a history of alcoholism, a violent temper, or a day-long binge across multiple types of spirits. No, it was about the absinthe. The Green Fairy was no longer a playful muse. She was a murderous fiend, pulling the strings of unsuspecting men, turning them into cold-blooded killers. The story was tailor-made for the anti-absinthe campaigners. It had everything: a gruesome crime, innocent victims, and a clear, unambiguous villain in the form of the notorious green liquor. The media seized upon it with an almost carnivorous glee. Headlines screamed about absinthe madness and the poison of absinthe. The temperance societies had their smoking gun, their undeniable evidence that this particular spirit was not just damaging, but inherently evil. But let's deconstruct the facts of the case with a bit more sober analysis, shall we? John Lanfray was, by all accounts, a chronic alcoholic. He had a long history of heavy drinking, frequently becoming violent when intoxicated. His daily routine often involved consuming large quantities of various spirits, not just absinthe. On that fateful day, his intake included not only the 2 glasses of absinthe, but also 2 glasses of crème de menthe, a glass of brandy, and a liter of wine. That, my friends, is enough alcohol to incapacitate, if not outright kill, a small horse, let alone trigger a violent outburst in an already volatile individual. The absinthe, in this tragic tableau, was merely one ingredient in a potent toxic brew. It conveniently took the fall for a complex tragedy rooted in pre-existing alcoholism, unchecked aggression, and a society that largely failed to address either. It was far easier to blame the mysterious, green, hallucinogenic drink than to confront the uncomfortable realities of addiction, mental health, and the pervasive culture of excessive alcohol consumption that afflicted so many. The Lanfray case wasn't unique in its specifics, but it was unique in its timing and its impact. It provided the anti-absinthe movement with the moral authority and public outrage it needed to push for outright prohibition. It galvanized public opinion, transforming abstract fears into concrete, horrific imagery. "This could happen to your family," whispered the propagandists, "if you let the green fairy into your home." And so, this horrific act of violence, fueled by a man's demons and a lethal cocktail of spirits, became the ultimate indictment of absinthe. It painted the green fairy as a literal demon, one that incited murder and destroyed families. The reverberations of the Lanfray massacre echoed across Switzerland, across Europe, and eventually across the Atlantic, signaling the beginning of the end for our Emerald Enchantress. Her days were numbered, her reputation irrevocably stained with the blood of innocents, all because she was the most convenient, most visually striking scapegoat available. A darkly comedic irony, really, that a beverage could be blamed for the utter depravity of a human being. The horrifying reverberations of the Lanfray family massacre proved to be the ultimate catalyst. It provided the moral outrage, the concrete evidence, however circumstantial, that the anti-absinthe movement had so desperately needed. The public, already primed by years of sensationalist articles and vivid propaganda, was now convinced. Absinthe was not just a drink, it was a societal menace, a liquid devil that needed to be exorcised. And so, the snowball effect began, leading to a swift and decisive, albeit profoundly ill-informed, prohibition era for the green fairy. The timeline of bans across Europe and the United States reads like a death knell for our emerald friend. Switzerland, the very birthplace of absinthe, was naturally the first to act, propelled by the raw trauma of the Lanfray tragedy within its own borders. In 1907, a public petition demanding a ban garnered an astonishing 82,000 signatures, leading to a referendum. By 1910, absinthe was officially outlawed in Switzerland. It was a rapid, furious response, driven by emotion and public fear rather than any robust scientific consensus. Belgium followed suit in 1905, even before Switzerland, demonstrating how the anxieties surrounding absinthe were already widespread. Then came the Netherlands in 1909. But the biggest blow, the truly symbolic death knell, came in 1915 when France, the very heartland of absinthe culture, where Le Vert had reigned supreme, finally banned the drink. Imagine, the French, those stalwart defenders of fine wine and strong spirits, turning their backs on their beloved green fairy. It was akin to the British banning tea or the Americans outlawing complaining. It meant business. The United States, always eager to join a good moral panic, enacted its own ban in 1912, preceding even France. Other countries followed suit: Italy, Spain, Germany. The tide had definitively turned. Absinthe, once the chic symbol of artistic rebellion, was now an international pariah, deemed too dangerous, too corrupting, too green for civilized society. The legal arguments presented during these legislative battles were a fascinating blend of genuine concern, scientific illiteracy, and outright demagoguery. Proponents of the ban cited the scientific evidence of absinthism, A syndrome, as we've discussed, that was more a catch-all for various forms of extreme alcoholism, lead poisoning, and untreated mental illness. They trotted out medical experts, of the era, naturally, who solemnly testified to the unique, devastating effects of thujone, painting it as a powerful hallucinogen and neurotoxin, despite a profound lack of rigorous empirical evidence at the time to support such claims in typical consumption scenarios. They paraded victims, or rather alleged victims, whose misfortunes were conveniently laid at the feet of the Green Fairy. They painted vivid pictures of families ruined, fortunes squandered, and minds utterly shattered, all due to the insidious influence of wormwood. It was a masterclass in emotional manipulation, preying on societal anxieties and a deep-seated fear of anything that disrupted the established order. And, as with most forms of prohibition, there were undoubtedly economic motivations at play. The wine industry, which had seen its market share aggressively eaten into by absinthe's surging popularity and cheap price point, certainly wasn't shedding any tears. In fact, many influential wine producers actively campaigned for the ban, viewing absinthe as an existential threat to their venerable industry. Nothing quite like a bit of economic self-interest dressed up in the garb of moral rectitude, is there? The action was swift, decisive, and overwhelmingly popular. Absinthe, once the very symbol of Parisian cool, was suddenly rendered illegal, relegated to the shadows of history. Production ceased, bottles were smashed, and the ritual of the slotted spoon became a forbidden memory. The cafes, once bustling with the clinking of glasses and the slow louche of the green, were forced to adapt. It marked the end of an era, a vibrant, chaotic, deeply flawed era where art and alcohol intertwined in a dangerous dance. The Green Fairy was banished, buried under a mountain of moral indignation and pseudo-scientific fear-mongering. For decades, her name would only be whispered, a ghost of a glamorous, dangerous past, a stark warning against the perils of intoxicating excess. And you, dear listener, have just witnessed her dramatic, rather ignominious demise. A sobering thought, perhaps, in this long, slow journey toward sleep. Well, you can ban a drink, legislate against its existence, and even smash its bottles, but you can't quite erase its taste from a culture, or its powerful grip on the popular imagination. When absinthe was banned, it didn't just vanish into the ether, leaving a gaping, anise-flavored hole in the hearts of its devotees. Oh no, it went underground, like any self-respecting, dangerously alluring illicit substance. It became a clandestine ritual, whispered about in hushed tones, sought out by those who craved its forbidden kick. Imagine the speakeasies of the absinthe world. Not glamorous, perhaps, but certainly atmospheric. In shadowy corners of illicit bars, or in the privacy of one's own home, guarded bottles would be produced. The slotted spoon might be replaced by a fork, the sugar cube might be rationed, and the water drip might be a little less ceremonial, a little more desperate. But the fundamental desire for that bitter, licoricey hit, that peculiar sense of mind-expanding clarity, or blurring, depending on the individual, remained. True absinthe, smuggled across borders or distilled in secret, became even more desirable precisely because it was forbidden. The allure of the illicit, after all, is a powerful intoxicant in itself. But for the vast majority, the truly dedicated Green Fairy enthusiasts who weren't quite ready to risk jail time for a sip of wormwood, other options emerged. And this, my friends, is where we meet the ersatz absinthe, the imitators, the spiritual successors who carried on the anise tradition, albeit without the infamous wormwood, and crucially, without the thujone that had caused all the fuss. These were drinks like Pernod, Ricard, and Pastis. And yes, you might recognize those names because they went on to become cultural staples in their own right, particularly in France. They retained the distinct, powerful anise flavor profile that had been so central to absinthe's appeal. They had that characteristic clouding, or louche, when water was added, creating a visual link to the banned beverage. But they were, crucially, lower in alcohol, though still quite respectable, and entirely sans wormwood. No thujone, no hallucinations, no angry mobs blaming your drink for societal collapse. Just good old-fashioned, licorice-flavored booze. Pernod Phils, the very company that had propelled absinthe into stardom, pivoted brilliantly. They simply took the wormwood out of their recipe and created Pernod Anise, which became an instant hit. Ricard followed, producing its own popular anise-flavored spirit. These drinks filled the void left by absinthe's disappearance, offering a familiar taste and ritual without the legal headaches. The public embraced them with enthusiasm. Pastis, a generic term for these anise-flavored aperitifs, became the new afternoon drink of choice, particularly in the south of France. Imagine the vibrant markets of Provence, the hot sun beating down, and the ubiquitous sight of locals sipping their cloudy, pale yellow pastis diluted with water, ice clinking in the glass. It became synonymous with the French way of life, an essential part of the aperitif culture. The taste was familiar, comforting, and refreshing. It carried on the spirit of absinthe, if not its exact botanical composition. And yet, despite the rise of these legal, less contentious anise spirits, the lingering cultural memory of absinthe persisted. It became a legend, a tantalizing ghost of a bygone era. Artists and writers, looking back, romanticized its power, its dangers, its role in the creative process. It was the forbidden fruit, the drink of true bohemians, a symbol of a time when boundaries were pushed and rules were broken. People spoke of the good old days, when you could still get a proper glass of the green stuff, perhaps with a wistful sigh and a conspiratorial wink. Even in its absence, absinthe continued to influence art and literature, fueling the mystique of the tormented genius and the allure of forbidden pleasure. Its name became a shorthand for artistic excess and a specific kind of intellectual debauchery. It was almost more powerful in its banishment, elevated to mythical status, freed from the mundane realities of mere intoxication. So, while the physical bottles of absinthe might have been banished from the legal landscape, its essence, its taste, and its legendary reputation lingered like a particularly stubborn hangover. The Green Fairy had been buried, yes, but her ghost continued to haunt the cafes and artistic studios of Europe, a testament to the enduring human fascination with the forbidden and the remarkable adaptability of the alcohol industry. And you, dear listener, are now drinking in the cultural aftershocks of a ban that tried to erase a spirit, but only succeeded in cementing its legend. For decades, absinthe remained a pariah, a whispered legend, a relic of a bygone era of artistic madness and moral panic. Its name conjured images of green demons, severed ears, and societal decay. It was the bad boy of the liquor cabinet, indefinitely grounded. But history, like a particularly persistent drunk, has a funny way of repeating itself, or at least of revisiting its past mistakes with a touch more scientific rigor. And so, in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, a slow, quiet lifting of the bans began, ushering in the grand revival of the Green Fairy, albeit a much tamer, more regulated version. The journey back from prohibition for absinthe began gradually, almost stealthily. By the late 1990s, some countries, primarily in the EU, began to re-evaluate the archaic laws surrounding the drink. The key factor here was modern science, which, unlike its Victorian predecessor, had the benefit of actual laboratory equipment and a deeper understanding of neurochemistry. Remember our notorious friend thujone? The supposed hallucinogenic culprit that made artists see tiny green polka-dotted elephants tap dancing on their canvases? Well, modern scientific understanding provided a rather decisive and, admittedly, rather boring myth-busting revelation. Thujone, at typical, regulated doses found in traditionally distilled absinthe, is not a hallucinogen. You would, as previously established, succumb to acute alcohol poisoning long before you hit hallucinogenic levels of thujone. The human body is surprisingly resilient, but not that resilient. What scientists discovered was that while thujone is indeed a neurotoxic compound, which means it can be harmful to nerve cells, its hallucinogenic properties were vastly exaggerated. The levels present in historical absinthe, and certainly in modern regulated absinthe, were simply not sufficient to induce psychedelic effects. The demons artists claimed to see were far more likely the result of sheer, unadulterated alcohol intoxication, coupled with a dash of lead poisoning from shoddy distilling, a sprinkle of poor nutrition, and a generous dollop of untreated mental illness, all seasoned with a society eager for a scapegoat. It was a perfect storm of unfortunate circumstances, not a specific thujone-induced trip. Today, modern absinthe production is strictly regulated, especially concerning thujone content. The European Union, for instance, set a maximum level of 35 milligrams of thujone per liter for absinthe. In the U.S., the Food and Drug Administration, FDA, stipulates that absinthe must be thujone-free, which practically means less than 10 parts per million, a negligible amount. This means that contemporary absinthe, while still a potent spirit in terms of alcohol content, has been effectively declawed of its mythical, mind-bending power. You're far more likely to get an aggressively clear head and a truly epic hangover than a conversation with a sentient, green, one-legged leprechaun. This newfound scientific clarity paved the way for the craft absinthe movement. This isn't your great-great-grandfather's dodgy, possibly lead-laced absinthe. This is artisanal stuff. Distillers, fascinated by the history and the unique botanical profile, began recreating historical recipes, often with meticulous attention to detail and a profound respect for the traditional methods. They focused on premium products, using high-quality botanicals and proper distillation techniques. Imagine these modern absinthaires, like culinary archaeologists, digging through old texts, experimenting with different wormwood varietals, and carefully balancing the notes of anise, fennel, hyssop, and lemon balm. They're separating fact from the fantastical propaganda of yesteryear, not just in terms of thujone, but in the entire cultural narrative. They're demonstrating that authentic absinthe, when made correctly and consumed responsibly, a radical concept, I know, is a complex herbal spirit with a unique flavor profile, not a portal to the abyss. So, you can now walk into a well-stocked liquor store or a discerning bar and order a glass of legitimate absinthe, complete with the slotted spoon and the sugar cube. The louche will still form, its mesmerizing clouding a nod to its storied past. The taste will still be distinctly anise-heavy, perhaps bitter, certainly potent. But the lurking fear of immediate, brain-melting insanity, that, my friends, has largely been put to rest. The Green Fairy has returned, but she's been through rehab. She's shed her demon wings and embraced a more responsible, scientifically validated existence. She's still alluring, still mysterious, but now you know her secret. She was mostly just very, very good at marketing a really strong drink. And society was very, very good at concocting a deliciously terrifying narrative around it. And as you sip, or perhaps gently waft, this modern incarnation, you can appreciate its history, its complexity, and the satisfying debunking of a century-old myth. No demons, just a good, strong drink. Slightly disappointing, in a way, isn't it? All right, you persistent purveyors of historical curiosities, we've traversed the gaslit streets of Victorian Paris, sniffed the dubious medicinal claims of Dr. Ordinaire, witnessed the rise and catastrophic fall of a cultural icon, and even peeked behind the scientific curtain. Now it's time to confront the central, sleep-inducing question one last time, with the kind of definitive, yet still gloriously sarcastic answer you've come to expect. So, did those poor, tormented Victorian artists actually see demons after downing a few glasses of the Green Fairy? No, probably not. At least not because of the thujone in the absinthe itself. Let's be brutally honest, shall we? It wasn't some mystical, hallucinogenic property of wormwood turning their brains into a surrealist painting. It was a potent, truly magnificent cocktail of factors, stirred with the frantic desperation of an era that excelled at ignoring its own problems and blaming them on a convenient, emerald-hued scapegoat. First, you had the cheap, often adulterated alcohol. Remember, absinthe was often the drink of choice for the working poor and the struggling artists precisely because it was so affordable. And affordable often meant cut with whatever noxious substances were cheapest. We're talking industrial alcohol, sometimes even wood alcohol, which can cause blindness and death. Not exactly a recipe for pristine mental clarity, is it? Then, let's not forget the delightful possibility of lead poisoning. Those cheap copper stills, often used by less reputable distillers, leached heavy metals into the liquor. Lead, as we've already established, is a neurotoxin. It causes neurological damage, tremors, cognitive impairment, and a general sense of being thoroughly unwell. So, if you were feeling a bit fuzzy, prone to delusions, and your hands wouldn't stop shaking, it might have been the lead slowly pickling your brain, not a tiny green sprite whispering secrets. Add to that a diet that was likely appalling. Starving artists, even famous ones, rarely ate balanced meals. Malnutrition, particularly deficiencies in B vitamins, can lead to conditions like Korsakoff syndrome, which causes severe memory loss and confabulation, making up stories to fill memory gaps. So those wild tales of green demons might have been less of a supernatural encounter and more of a nutrient-deprived brain politely attempting to fill in the blanks. And then the heavy hitters, untreated mental illness. The Victorian era was not exactly known for its enlightened approach to psychological disorders. Bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, severe depression, these were often misunderstood, stigmatized, and certainly rarely treated effectively. If you were predisposed to psychosis, a gallon of high-proof alcohol, coupled with a miserable existence, was a perfectly adequate trigger for hallucinations. No wormwood magic required. And finally, the insidious creep of syphilis. Narrow syphilis, in its later stages, could wreak havoc on the brain, causing delusions, paranoia, and, yes, terrifying visions. It was the silent pandemic of the era, and its effects could easily be attributed to the latest sensational vice. So, you see, the demons these artists purportedly saw were less a product of a specific, wormwood-induced hallucinatory trip, and more the inevitable culmination of cheap, toxic alcohol, chronic poisoning, abject poverty, untreated mental illness, insidious disease, immense social pressures, and an excellent, self-serving narrative crafted by both the artists and the temperance movements. It was a collective delusion, beautifully, tragically, and quite comically packaged in an emerald bottle. The Green Fairy, it turns out, was a symptom, not the disease. She was a reflection of the anxieties, excesses, and profound ignorance of an era. She became a lightning rod for all the things people feared about modernity, about art, about losing control. She gave people a convenient, tangible thing to blame for the messy, tangible, and often heartbreaking realities of human fallibility. And that, my dear insomniac, is the intoxicating blend of history, hype, and human fallibility. A perfect recipe, wouldn't you say, for a long, quiet night's sleep. Or at least, a highly sarcastic chuckle. If you've managed to stay awake through this entire, painstakingly detailed exposition, congratulations. Your brain is clearly more resilient than the average Victorian artist's, or you have a truly remarkable capacity for boredom. Either way, consider subscribing. Or don't. History doesn't care.